It started as just another busy morning at Café Bell, a cozy coffee shop tucked away on a quiet street in the heart of the bustling city. The cafe had been around for years, known for its warm atmosphere, delicious pastries, and coffee that could wake anyone up, no matter how tired they were. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the sweet aroma of muffins and cookies filled the air, wrapping the cafe in a comforting embrace. The soft hum of chatter, the clinking of cups, and the gentle notes of jazz music playing in the background created the perfect setting for a new day. For Clara Jenkins, the morning began the way it always did. She arrived early, just as the first light of dawn peeked over the rooftops. The streets were still quiet, and the city hadn't yet woken up. Clara liked this time of day. It gave her a chance to breathe, to gather her thoughts before the hustle and bustle of the cafe took over. Clara was young, only 23, but life had already thrown its share of challenges her way. She had grown up in a small town, dreaming of a better life in the big city. When she was younger, she'd often sit by her window, staring at the stars, imagining herself doing something great. She didn't know exactly what it would be, but she was determined to make something of herself. Moving to the city had been her first big step. She had packed everything she owned into one suitcase and boarded a bus, her heart pounding with excitement and fear. When she arrived, the towering buildings and endless streets had overwhelmed her. But Clara was nothing if not resilient. She found a tiny apartment, just big enough for a bed and a small kitchen, and started looking for work. That's how she ended up at Café Bell. The cafe wasn't glamorous, but it was cozy, and the people who worked there felt like a little family. Clara had been hired as a waitress 6 months ago. At first, she had been nervous, unsure if she could keep up with the fast pace and demanding customers. But over time, she learned the rhythm of the job. She knew how to carry 3 plates at once without dropping them, how to make perfect latte art when the barista was too busy, and how to keep a polite smile even when a customer was being rude. Clara loved her job most days. She liked seeing the regulars who came in every morning, the elderly couple who always shared a scone, the young woman who brought her laptop and worked for hours while sipping chai, and the man who always ordered a black coffee and read the newspaper. She liked the way the sunlight streamed through the large windows, making the cafe feel warm and welcoming. But not every day was easy. The cafe attracted all kinds of people. Some were kind, leaving generous tips and thanking her with genuine smiles. Others were impatient, tapping their feet if their coffee took too long or complaining about the smallest things. Clara had learned to handle them all with grace. But then there were customers like Eleanor Hastings. Eleanor wasn't just any customer. She was the kind of woman who made an impression the moment she walked into a room. Tall, elegant, and always dressed in the latest designer clothes, Eleanor carried herself with an air of importance. Her heels clicked loudly against the tiled floor, and her eyes scanned the cafe as if she were inspecting it. Her jewelry sparkled under the soft cafe lights, and her perfume lingered in the air long after she passed by. Eleanor had a way of making people feel small. She didn't shout or throw tantrums. Instead, her sharp words and condescending tone cut through the air like a knife. To her, people like Clara were invisible, or worse, beneath her notice. Clara had dealt with Eleanor before. She came to the cafe often, always ordering the same thing: a double espresso with a splash of cream. She would sit at her favorite table by the window, scrolling through her phone or flipping through a glossy magazine, and she always found something to complain about. The coffee was too hot, the cream wasn't fresh, the table wasn't clean enough. Clara had learned to brace herself whenever she saw Eleanor walk through the door. She would take a deep breath, put on her best smile, and do her job. She had heard the other waitresses whispering about Eleanor, calling her Queen Hastings behind her back. But Clara tried not to judge. She didn't know Eleanor's story, and she believed in treating everyone with kindness, no matter how they acted. But today felt different. Clara couldn't put her finger on it, but there was something in the air. Maybe it was the way the sunlight seemed brighter than usual, casting long shadows across the floor. Or maybe it was the nervous energy she felt as she tied her apron and prepared for her shift. Whatever it was, Clara had a feeling that this day would be anything but ordinary. The officer chuckled, a short, dismissive laugh that echoed with arrogance. "Fairly, are you questioning how I do my job?" he said, stepping closer to Marcus. The crowd grew silent, their collective breath held in anticipation. Marcus didn't back down. His calm demeanor only seemed to agitate the officer further, but Marcus knew that losing his cool wouldn't help. This moment wasn't just about the young man. It was about something bigger. It was about standing up against the misuse of power, about being a voice for those who were too afraid to speak. "You're doing your job." "Sure," Marcus replied, his tone even. "But there's a difference between doing your job and abusing it." The tension in the air was almost tangible now. The crowd was no longer just watching. They were invested. Phones were out, recording the scene as whispers spread through the onlookers. Who was this man who dared to challenge authority so calmly? The officer's face darkened, his hand twitching near his belt. "You need to back off," he warned, his voice low but menacing. Marcus took another step forward, his eyes locked on the officer's. "Or what?" he asked, his voice cutting through the officer's threat like a blade. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The crowd held their breath, the officer froze, and Marcus stood firm. It was as if time itself had stopped to bear witness to this standoff. Marcus wasn't just a man standing up for a stranger. He was a symbol of courage, a reminder that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. But the story was far from over. As the officer's hand moved to his radio, Marcus spoke again, his words deliberate and measured. "Before you do anything, officer, I think you should know something." The officer hesitated, his confidence faltering for the first time. The crowd leaned in, their curiosity growing by the second. What was Marcus about to reveal? What could he possibly say that would make a difference in this tense standoff? Marcus reached into his pocket slowly, his movements deliberate to avoid alarming anyone. The officer's hand twitched again, but Marcus's calm demeanor kept him from acting rashly. "I think you should check the facts before you act," Marcus said, pulling out his phone. His voice was still calm, but now it carried a hint of authority that made even the officer pause. The crowd began to murmur again, their phones still recording every moment. The young man, who had been silent all this time, looked at Marcus with a mix of hope and disbelief. Was this stranger really going to stand up for him? Marcus turned his phone screen toward the officer. "This interaction is being recorded," he said plainly. "And I'm not the only one documenting it." The officer's eyes darted around, noticing the phones in the hands of nearly every bystander. The arrogance in his expression gave way to uncertainty, and for the first time, he seemed to realize the weight of the situation. But Marcus wasn't done. "You see, officer," he continued, "accountability is a powerful thing. It ensures that power isn't misused, that people like you and me are held to the same standards. And today, we're all witnesses to that." The officer's jaw tightened, his face flushing with a mix of anger and embarrassment. The crowd, emboldened by Marcus's words, began to murmur their support. Some even called out, questioning the officer's actions. The balance of power had shifted, but the story was just beginning. Marcus had taken a stand, but what came next would test everyone involved. The officer had a choice to make, and so did the crowd. Would they stand together, or would fear silence them once again? In the end, Marcus knew one thing for sure. The truth always has a way of coming to light, and today that light was shining brighter than ever. The neighborhood was one of those places where everyone knew someone but pretended not to. The air carried a strange energy that day, heavier than usual, as if the city itself could sense what was about to happen. People moved through the streets with their usual pace, some rushing to work, others lingering around the corner stores. But Marcus Wright walked with purpose. He wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him. Marcus had always been the type to keep his head down, not because he was weak, but because he understood the cost of speaking out. He knew what happened to people who challenged the system, especially people like him. But something inside him had changed recently. It wasn't anger, though anger was there. It was resolve. A quiet determination that told him he could no longer let things slide. Then, just ahead, the familiar sight of Officer Daniels caught Marcus's attention. Daniels was known in the area, though not for the right reasons. Tall and broad, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been questioned. His badge gleamed under the sunlight, but the authority it symbolized often felt more like a weapon than a shield. Daniels stood near a small group of teenagers, one of whom was seated on a curb with his head hung low. The boy couldn't have been older than 15. His backpack was open, its contents scattered on the pavement: a few notebooks, a couple of pens, and a crumpled lunch bag. Daniels towered over him, barking orders that the boy seemed too scared to follow. "You think you're smart, huh? Answer me." Daniels snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut through the noise of the street. The boy muttered something, his voice barely audible. Daniels leaned closer, his hand resting on the holster at his side, and repeated his question louder this time. "I said, answer me. What are you hiding?" Marcus slowed his pace, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. He didn't know the boy, but that didn't matter. He had seen this play out too many times. A kid too young to defend himself, an officer too sure of his power, and a crowd too afraid to intervene. People were already gathering, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Some whispered to each other, shaking their heads but staying at a safe distance. A few pulled out their phones, but no one stepped forward. It was the kind of silence that Marcus hated the most, the kind that let injustice happen in plain sight. Daniels, oblivious to the growing crowd, grabbed the boy's backpack and held it up for everyone to see. "What's in here, huh? Drugs? Stolen goods?" His voice tripped with accusation, each word a sharp jab at the boy's dignity. The boy shook his head frantically, his eyes wide with fear. "It's just my school stuff," he stammered, his voice cracking. Daniels sneered, unzipping the backpack further and turning it upside down. The remaining contents spilled out onto the ground. A textbook, a calculator, and a battered comic book. The boy reached out instinctively to gather his things, but Daniels stepped on one of the notebooks, stopping him. "You think I believe that?" Daniels asked, his tone mocking. "Kids like you always have something to hide." Marcus clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. The tension in the air was suffocating, but he couldn't stay silent. He knew what would happen if he spoke up. Daniels would see it as a challenge, an attack on his authority. But Marcus also knew what would happen if he didn't. The boy would carry this moment with him forever, a memory of humiliation and helplessness. Taking a deep breath, Marcus stepped forward. His movement caught Daniels' attention immediately. The officer straightened up, his hand still resting on the holster as he turned to face Marcus. "Can I help you?" Daniels asked, his tone dismissive. Marcus met his gaze, his voice steady but firm. "You're already helping yourself to that boy's dignity. Don't you think that's enough?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Daniels' eyes narrowed, his body tensing as he sized Marcus up. "And who are you to tell me how to do my job?" He shot back, his voice louder now. Marcus didn't flinch. "Just someone who's tired of watching you misuse that badge," he replied. The tension was palpable now, the crowd holding their breath as the two men stared each other down. Daniels was used to being in control, to having the final say. But Marcus's calm defiance threw him off balance. Daniels took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. "I don't think you understand how this works. I ask the questions. I give the orders. And you stay out of my way." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "I understand perfectly," he said. "You think the badge gives you power, but real power comes from doing the right thing, not from intimidating kids." The crowd stirred, their murmurs growing louder. Some people nodded in agreement, their courage bolstered by Marcus's words. Daniels, however, wasn't impressed. His face reddened, and his hand tightened around the holster. "You're walking a fine line," Daniels warned. "I suggest you step back before you regret it." But Marcus didn't move. His voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now, a quiet strength that cut through Daniels' bluster. "The only thing I regret," Marcus said, "is that people like you think they can get away with this." Daniels' face twisted in anger, but before he could respond, a voice from the crowd called out, "Yeah, leave the kid alone." Another voice chimed in, then another. The murmurs turned into shouts, the crowd finding their voice. Daniels glanced around, his confidence faltering as he realized he was no longer in control. But Marcus wasn't done. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on Daniels. "This isn't just about him," Marcus said, nodding toward the boy. "It's about all the times you've used that badge to bully and belittle. It's about accountability. And today, we're holding you to it." Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. The crowd was no longer just watching. They were witnesses. Phones were pointed at him from every angle, capturing every word, every movement. For the first time, Daniels looked unsure. He glanced at the boy, then back at Marcus, his hand slowly moving away from the holster. The power dynamic had shifted, and he knew it, but the tension wasn't gone. Marcus could feel it in the air, heavy and electric. This wasn't over. Not yet. Daniels might have backed down for now, but Marcus knew that standing up to power always came with a cost. Still, as he looked at the boy, now clutching his backpack tightly, Marcus felt a surge of determination. This moment was bigger than him, bigger than Daniels. It was about drawing a line, about showing everyone, especially those watching from the sidelines, that standing up was worth it. And as the crowd began to rally behind him, Marcus realized something else. This wasn't just his fight. It was theirs too. And together, they were stronger than anyone who tried to silence them. Marcus stood his ground as the crowd around him grew thicker, their whispers filling the air like the hum of an engine ready to roar. Daniels wasn't backing down, and Marcus didn't expect him to. Bullies rarely did, not when they were being washed. "Let me guess," Daniels said with a sneer. "You think you're some kind of hero." His voice dripped with disdain, loud enough for the gathering audience to hear. "But heroes don't win in the real world. People like me do." Marcus said nothing. He could feel the tension rising, like a tide inching closer to the shore, but he refused to be swept away by it. Instead, he let the silence linger, a quiet resistance that rattled Daniels more than any words could. The officer took a step forward, his boots crunching on the gravel, his towering frame casting a shadow over Marcus. "You're awfully quiet now," Daniels taunted. "What's the matter?" Finally realizing you're out of your depth. Marcus didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket, moving slowly, deliberately. The crowd tensed, their eyes widening. Daniel's hand flew to his holster, his fingers twitching in anticipation. "Careful," Daniels warned, his voice sharp. "Don't make a mistake you can't take back." But Marcus wasn't reaching for a weapon. He pulled out a small, worn notebook, its edges frayed from years of use. It wasn't much to look at, but to Marcus it was everything. "What's that supposed to be?" Daniels scoffed, his bravado returning as he realized there was no immediate threat. Marcus held the notebook up for everyone to see. "This," he said, his voice calm but firm, "is proof that you don't always win." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. People leaned closer, craning their necks to get a better look. Daniels narrowed his eyes, his confidence faltering just slightly. "You're bluffing," Daniels said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had earlier. Marcus flipped open the notebook, thumbing through its pages until he found what he was looking for. "You remember last year," he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear, "when a shopkeeper reported you for harassment? Or how about the time you pulled over a mother of 3 for no reason other than the color of her skin?" Daniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Marcus took a step closer, holding the notebook like a shield. "You think people forget," Marcus continued. "You think your badge erases everything. But it doesn't. People remember. I remember." The crowd's murmurs turned into gasps. Some of them had been there for those incidents, had witnessed Daniel's abuse of power, but had been too afraid to speak out. Seeing Marcus confront him now gave them a sense of vindication, a spark of hope. Daniels tried to regain control, his voice rising to drown out the crowd. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped. "You don't have any proof." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression unyielding. "Don't I?" he asked, flipping to another page in the notebook. "Because I wrote down every name, every date, every detail. And I'm not the only one. There are witnesses. There are stories. You've built your power on fear, but fear only works as long as people stay silent." For the first time, Daniels looked uncertain. His hand hovered near his holster, but he didn't draw it. He glanced at the crowd, now emboldened by Marcus's words. Some of them had their phones out, recording everything. Others were nodding, their expressions a mix of anger and determination. "You're making a mistake," Daniels said, though his voice wavered. Marcus shook his head. "The only mistake would be letting you continue," he said. The crowd shifted, their collective energy growing stronger. A woman stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "He's right," she said. "I've seen what you do. We all have." Another person chimed in, then another. Their voices joined together, a chorus of stories and accusations that left Daniels visibly shaken. He tried to argue, to defend himself, but his words were drowned out by the rising tide of voices. And then Marcus did something unexpected. He closed the notebook and slipped it back into his pocket. "This isn't just about you," he said, addressing Daniels directly. "It's about what you represent. It's about a system that allows people like you to abuse your power. But that system only works if we let it. And we're done letting it." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the street. Daniels took a step back, his confidence shattered. He looked around, searching for an ally, but found none. Marcus turned to face the crowd, his voice rising above the noise. "This isn't over," he said. "But today, we've taken the first step. And every step after this will bring us closer to the change we deserve." The energy in the crowd was electric, a mix of anger, hope, and determination. People who had once stayed silent now found their voices, their courage sparked by Marcus's defiance. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the street, Marcus knew that the real fight was just beginning. But he also knew he wasn't alone. For the first time, he felt the weight of his burden lighten, carried not just by him, but by everyone who stood with him. The rising action was far from over, but the small revelations had already begun to shift the balance. Marcus had planted a seed, one that would grow with every story told, every voice raised, and every step taken toward justice. The street seemed to hold its breath. The crowd, once a murmur of voices and shuffling feet, had grown completely silent. All eyes were on Marcus as he stood firm, his calm presence in stark contrast to the fury brewing beneath Officer Daniels' exterior. Daniels' confidence had taken a hit, but he wasn't one to back down easily. His hand hovered near his belt, not on his gun, but on the radio clipped to his hip. His fingers twitched, ready to call for backup, not to de-escalate, but to reinforce his authority. "You've made your point," Daniels sneered, though a bead of sweat trailed down his temple. "But let me tell you something, kid. Words don't change the world. Action does. And I'm the one with the power to act." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanging. "You think power comes from a badge," he said, his voice steady and measured. "But true power comes from accountability. And it's time for yours." Before Daniels could respond, Marcus raised his hand. It wasn't an aggressive gesture but a signal, a quiet command that rippled through the crowd like a spark igniting dry timber. Several people moved at once, their actions swift and deliberate. From the back of the crowd, A man stepped forward holding a tablet, the screen glowing brightly in the dimming light. "Is this what you mean by action, Officer Daniels?" Marcus asked, his tone still calm, but laced with an edge that cut through the tension. The man with the tablet tapped the screen, and a video began to play. The footage was grainy but unmistakable. It showed Daniels standing over a young man, his posture domineering, his voice raised. The audio crackled, but Daniels' words were clear as day. "You think you can talk to me like that? Do you know who I am?" Gasps rippled through the crowd as the video continued. The young man in the footage, barely out of his teens, stood frozen in fear. Daniels shoved him, hard enough to make him stumble, and then grabbed his arm, yanking him forward. "You don't get to question me," Daniels barked. The video ended, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. Daniels' face turned red, a mix of anger and panic. "That doesn't prove anything," he said quickly, his voice rising in desperation. "You don't know the full story. That kid, he was resisting arrest." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you're going with?" he asked. Another person in the crowd stepped forward, holding up their phone. "I have footage too," they said, their voice trembling with both fear and determination. "And this time, it's from yesterday. Same officer, same behavior." The phone screen lit up, showing Daniels once again, this time berating a middle-aged woman who had parked her car slightly over the line in a quiet lot. "You people never learn," Daniels snapped in the video. "Maybe a fine will teach you a lesson." The woman pleaded with him, explaining that she was just picking up medication for her sick child, but Daniels showed no mercy. The crowd erupted, their whispers turning into angry mutters and cries for justice. Daniels took a step back, his confidence eroding with every second. He opened his mouth to speak, but Marcus wasn't done. "Do you know what happens when people like you think they're untouchable?" Marcus asked, his voice cutting through the noise. "They leave a trail. And that trail leads straight to the truth." Marcus motioned to another person in the crowd, a young woman holding a laptop. She pressed a button, and yet another video began to play on a portable projector someone had set up. This time, it was footage from a security camera, crystal clear and damning. The video showed Daniels pulling over a car at a stoplight. The driver, a man in his 60s, was polite and compliant, handing over his license and registration without hesitation. But Daniels didn't stop there. He pulled the man out of the car, shoved him against the hood, and began searching the vehicle without cause. By now, Daniels' face had gone pale. "This is harassment," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You're twisting things, making me out to be some kind of monster." Marcus shook his head slowly. "You did that all by yourself," he said. And then the final blow. Marcus reached into his pocket once more, this time pulling out a small USB drive. He held it up for the crowd to see. "This," he said, "is everything. Years of complaints, eyewitness accounts, more footage. It's all here. And guess what? It's already been sent to the department, the press, and the city council." Daniels froze, his hand still hovering near his radio. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, their energy electrifying. People shouted Marcus's name, their voices filled with gratitude and admiration. For Daniels, there was no way out. His smirk was gone, replaced by a look of sheer panic. He stumbled backward, his hands raised as if to shield himself from the weight of the evidence. "This isn't over," he muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced. "Oh, it's over," Marcus said, his voice unwavering. "For you, at least. But for the rest of us, this is just the beginning." As Daniels stood there, his world unraveling, the reality of his actions crashing down on him, Marcus turned to the crowd. "We don't have to accept this," he said, his voice rising above the cheers. "We don't have to stay silent. Together, we are stronger than any badge, any title, any person who thinks they can act without consequence." The crowd roared in agreement, their voices shaking the very ground beneath their feet. Daniels, now visibly shaken, turned and pushed his way through the sea of people, his retreat a stark contrast to the confident bully he had been moments ago. Marcus stood tall, his presence commanding. The power dynamics had shifted entirely, and for the first time, justice didn't just feel like a distant dream. It felt real, tangible, and unstoppable. The big reveal wasn't just about exposing Daniels. It was about showing everyone watching, both in person and online, that change was possible. And in that moment, Marcus became more than just a man taking a stand. He became a symbol of hope, a reminder that the truth, no matter how long it takes, always comes to light. The next morning, the headlines were everywhere. On every screen, in every paper, and on every corner, people were talking about the moment a corrupt officer was finally held accountable. Marcus's stand wasn't just a local story. It was a movement that had sparked change, and the impact was impossible to ignore. Officer Daniels had been suspended within hours of the videos going public. The department, under pressure from city officials and an outraged community, launched a full-scale investigation. It wasn't just about Daniels anymore. His actions had opened the door to something much bigger, a deep dive into years of unchecked abuse, misconduct, and negligence that the public had been too afraid to challenge. For Daniels, there was no escape. The footage, the testimonies, the overwhelming evidence, it was airtight. He had nowhere to run. And as the truth came out, so did the consequences. By noon, Daniels was escorted out of the precinct in handcuffs. The crowd that had gathered outside erupted into cheers, their voices ringing with hope and a sense of long-overdue justice. "Marcus Wright," someone in the crowd shouted. "You're a hero." But Marcus didn't see himself that way. As the cameras swarmed him, reporters shoving microphones in his face, he remained calm, humble. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about all of us. It's about standing up together and saying, enough is enough." Daniels, on the other hand, was a shadow of his former self. The arrogance, the confidence, the smug grin, it was all gone. His head was lowered, his shoulders slumped, as he was led into the back of a police car. The same system he had abused for years had finally turned against him. But for Marcus, justice wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about seeing Daniels suffer or gloating over his downfall. It was about accountability, about making sure that no one else would have to endure what so many had faced in silence. The fallout was swift and far-reaching. The department released a public statement, promising reform and transparency. An independent review board was established, tasked with investigating past complaints and ensuring future cases would be handled fairly. For the first time in years, the community felt a glimmer of trust in the system. Marcus became a symbol of change, but he didn't let it go to his head. He returned to his quiet life, but his actions had left a permanent mark. People looked to him as a leader, a reminder that one person could make a difference. One evening, as Marcus walked home, he passed a mural painted on the side of a building. It showed a silhouette of a man standing tall, surrounded by a diverse crowd, their hands raised in unity. Beneath it, bold letters read, "The truth will always win." Marcus stopped for a moment, taking it in. He didn't need his name on the wall or the spotlight on him. Seeing the community united, inspired, and stronger than ever, that was enough. Weeks later, Daniels faced a trial that was open to the public. The courtroom was packed, and the tension was palpable. Marcus sat quietly in the back, watching as witnesses stepped forward, one after another, to share their stories. Their voices, once silenced by fear, were now powerful and unwavering. When the verdict came, it was clear. Daniels was found guilty on multiple counts, including abuse of power, falsifying reports, and harassment. He was sentenced to several years in prison, his career and reputation in ruins. For many, it was a moment of closure. For Marcus, it was a step in the right direction. After the trial, people approached him to shake his hand, to thank him, to share their own stories of courage and perseverance. One young man, barely in his 20s, hesitated before speaking. "Marcus," he said, his voice shaky, "you don't know me, but I've seen what you did. And because of you, I'm not afraid anymore." Marcus smiled, placing a reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder. "That's all that matters," he said simply. The weeks turned into months, and the movement continued to grow. Community meetings were held regularly, giving people a platform to voice their concerns and hold officials accountable. Policies were reviewed, and training programs were implemented to prevent future abuses. Marcus attended those meetings quietly, sitting in the back and listening. He didn't need to lead the charge anymore. The people had found their voices, and that, he thought, was the real victory. As he walked home one evening, the city felt different. The air was lighter, the streets more vibrant. It wasn't perfect, change rarely is, but it was progress. And for Marcus, that was enough. In the end, justice wasn't just about punishing one man. It was about building something better, something fair, something that would last. Marcus had taken a stand, but it was the community that had carried the torch. Together, they had turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change. And as Marcus stepped into his home, the faint glow of the city lights streaming through his window, he allowed himself a rare smile. Justice had been served, not just in the courtroom, but in the hearts and minds of the people. And for the first time in a long time, the future felt bright. They say moments of truth define who we are, not just for a single person, but for everyone watching. What happened with Marcus Wright wasn't just about one man standing up to injustice. It wasn't just about an officer losing his way or facing the consequences. It was about all of us, about the power of truth, courage, and the unyielding human spirit. Marcus didn't set out to become a hero. He didn't wake up that day expecting to challenge the status quo or to inspire a movement. He was just a man who refused to stay silent, a man who believed that respect and fairness weren't privileges, they were rights. And that belief, so simple yet so powerful, sparked a change no one saw coming. In the quiet moments after the trial, Marcus was asked what gave him the strength to stand firm. His answer was as honest as it was profound. It wasn't strength, it was necessity. When you've been quiet for too long, you realize the weight of your silence. Speaking up isn't bravery, it's survival. And in those words, there was a lesson for everyone. Silence allows injustice to grow, but a single voice can echo loud enough to tear it down. The story of Marcus Wright and Officer Daniels became a symbol, a reminder that power is not about control or fear. It's about responsibility. Daniels had used his badge as a weapon, but Marcus showed the world what real strength looked like. It wasn't in authority or force, it was in standing firm, even when the odds were stacked against him. Communities began to reflect on their own stories, their own struggles. Inspired by Marcus, people started speaking out, sharing their truths, and demanding accountability. It wasn't easy. Change never is, but it was a start. What Marcus taught us all is that resilience doesn't come from being unshaken by life's challenges. It comes from facing them head-on, from finding hope even when the path seems uncertain. His calm determination showed that dignity isn't something someone can take from you. It's something you carry within yourself, no matter the circumstances. And as for Daniels, his story is a stark reminder that actions have consequences. The badge he once wore didn't protect him from the truth, because justice has a way of catching up. His fall wasn't just about punishment. It was a lesson for others like him, a warning that no one is above the law. For Marcus, the journey didn't end with Daniels being led away in handcuffs. His fight wasn't just about a single moment. It was about creating a future where no one would have to endure what he did. His story isn't just one of justice served, but of hope renewed, of communities uniting to demand better for themselves and the generations to come. The mural painted in his honor captured his spirit perfectly. It didn't show Marcus alone, standing tall against the odds. It showed him surrounded by people, their hands raised together in unity. Because in the end, his story wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone who believed in fairness, truth, and the power of standing together. As time passed, people often asked Marcus if he had any regrets. His answer was always the same. I only regret not speaking up sooner, but now I know my voice matters. And so does yours. And that's the ultimate takeaway. The message that lingers long after the headlines fade and the cameras are turned off. One voice can make a difference, but many voices can create a movement. For those who feel overlooked, unheard, or powerless, Marcus's story is a beacon of hope. It's proof that even the quietest among us can spark a change that shakes the world. In the end, power doesn't come from a badge, a title, or authority. Real power comes from truth. It comes from courage. And it comes from people who believe that the world can, and should, be better. As Marcus Wright walked down the street, passing faces now filled with gratitude and respect, he carried himself the same way he always had, calm, steady, and unshaken. Because for him, this wasn't the end of the journey. It was just the beginning of something much bigger than himself. And so, the story ends with a simple truth that rings louder than any speech or headline. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about setting things right. And when one person has the courage to stand, they light the way for others to follow.